Here with more on the subject is our grumpy old man.
This is the Grumpy Old Man Podcast, hosted by Dave Mathwin. So close your yapper and just listen.
Welcome everybody for another episode, and I'm delighted to have with me a couple guests whom I'll introduce in a moment. Today, we're going to talk two movies, two of what I would consider to be some of the most profound and important movies of the last few decades. And that would be Stanley Kubrick's 2001 and Terrence Malick's Tree of Life. With me to discuss is AJ. AJ is a senior at Fontes Academy and has been one of my students for years. And also joining us, Mr. Zach Rallo, my colleague at Fontes, teaching Bible, literature, logic, and other things. Veritable man about town. Welcome to you both, gentlemen.
Thank you. It's really exciting to be here.
And welcome, AJ.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's an
My
honor.
pleasure. You'll notice I'm wearing black, my auteur film director black today. So I am ready, obviously. I hope you guys are. Let's start with 2001. I admit the first time I saw this movie, I was kind of like Homer Simpson, like, boring, this I thought was just, I could not understand what was going on. Found myself fast forwarding through lots of it. It took me a second viewing and really even a third viewing, I think, to start to grasp that this is, a truly great film and worthy of its reputation as a great film. Even though I'm not so sure that I agree with its message, yet the craft I thought was extraordinary. So you guys have just I've seen 2001 more recently than me. What are your reactions, Mr. Rallo? What were your thoughts initially, 2001?
So, I did not come into 2001 blind. I came in sort of knowing that it had this reputation and that it had these moments that are not traditional to be in films, right? The famous sort of cosmology sequence, the fact that it opens for 20 or so minutes with these sort of apes fighting and living with one another. And, but though, I will say, I think it lived up to its reputation. I think that it was a thoughtful film. It was a film that, and maybe AJ can speak more to this, cinematographically just so much had an impact on the viewer and forces the viewer maybe not to agree with its message, but to wrestle with its message and to question what it means to be human and what it means to live among others. And so I think certainly it's a film that's worth talking about, and I'm excited to be able to do that.
Great. AJ, your initial reaction?
When I watched 2001 for the first time, it was a very unique film watching experience. I've never watched a film that has been so, I guess, so big and so it's like overstimulation, especially that last sequence. It's very like, it's like your brain is on overload. I was really intrigued by that, and I really enjoy Kubrick's cinematography. Mm-hmm. I think his style is very exact and calculated, and obviously many of the shots in this movie are very, very, very impressive. Certainly way beyond the time that it was filmed. You'll forget if you watch this film, without knowing when it was put out, you'll be blown away that it was a 1968 film. It's crazy. So I was really intrigued by all these things, and I'm really looking forward to talking about it, really.
All right. Yes, absolutely. Let's get into it. I agree with you, AJ, what you're saying. Like, certainly some of those scenes, like the scene And okay, so sorry fans, like spoiler alert, you know, the movie's like 50 years old, but the kind of psychedelic, you know, creation sequence in 2001 is certainly intense. But I think the whole movie is that way, and I think part of the reason for that is it's a long movie, but it feels very tightly constructed, and each shot is so kind of meticulous that it kind of forces you to really pay attention. Maybe, why don't we start our conversation here? What is this movie saying about the film medium itself? I did read somewhere that Kubrick with 2001, wanted to make a statement, not just about humanity or the universe or whatever, but about films, making it so visual, and knowing the effect that that has, as we've all experienced it, making it so intensely visual. Why do you think, as influential as this film has been, it has not been influential, I think, in that respect? Most films we see are like most every other film. Why? What do you think about Kubrick's style here, and why maybe has it not really caught on? Or maybe you think that it has, I don't know. Mr. Rallo, your thoughts?
Right, I agree with you that the first thing that struck me when I watched the film was the prevalence of shots that really just stood still, right? These shots of just landscapes or of when you're out in the planets and in space, right, where really the camera for a lot of moments is just sort of sitting there. And I thought, as you say, it arrests you, right? It sort of forces you to sit and to think, what is the reason behind this shot? Like, why am I seeing this sort of sunset? Why am I seeing this landscape? In a way that I think most films aren't interested in asking you to consider why the camera is doing a certain thing. Does that make sense, right? Like your average Joe blockbuster Hollywood movie, it's not about the camera, it's about the action that's happening, the dialogue, the characters. Whereas here you could probably make the argument, AJ, I wonder if you would agree, that the camera is like a main character in a sense, or the camera is doing things in a way that it's not in other films. So I think that's the first thing that I would say I noticed.
What I would say about this movie and how Kubrick's style really, I think I love Kubrick's style because I think he understands something about film that many directors don't. Certainly, I think a lot of blockbuster filmmakers don't. Is that films are given this unique opportunity to communicate truth without communicating it with words. Like literature, right? It doesn't have pictures. It only has words, and it communicates truth through words. And now film has the opportunity to communicate these things with truth. It can communicate emotions, feelings, and like atmospheres, and it can communicate a lot more. And I think Kubrick does this because there's very little dialogue throughout the film. It is a huge emphasis on the shots and what's going around it, and sound. There's no sound in literature, but sound is very important in this film. So I don't think it has caught on, and I'm really sad about that because, like Mr. Rallo said, right, I think films of today are more about sort of being entertained rather than searching for the deeper meaning. So right. I guess that's what I would say about Kubrick's style.
Yeah, I think that's probably true, kind of what you said, AJ, that it's just, we don't think of film or movies in general. We don't want, when we think of watching a movie, most of the time, the vast majority of the time, that's not, the 2001 experience is not what we're looking for. Shoot, I mean, it's not what I'm looking for either, most of the time. Most of the time, right, I might be looking to be entertained. 2001 is not interested in that. And so maybe that shouldn't surprise us that it hasn't caught on. Although I wish it would catch on more, because I think Kubrick was really onto something. I think Malick, has noticed this, is one of perhaps the few directors that have noticed that and taken up that mantle. So you both have mentioned these important shots. What shots stood out to you? I have a couple that stand out to me as being quite important and like with this important imagery. AJ, we'll start with you. What would you say what are your one or two most important, you think, or arresting, or truth-telling shots or something along those lines? Go ahead.
The first one that jumps out to me is probably one of the last shots of the movie. The quote star child looking down and floating towards Earth. That's a very important, pertaining to my theories, that's a very important shot of the movie. And I guess second, is it possible if I could create, sort of combine all the monolith shots? Because I think those are very important.
Mm-hmm. Okay, what about them? What's important
very important about them?
Yeah.
Do you want me to explain what I think is more important about each shot?
Well, I'll tell you what. That's the monolith shots. Of course, the monolith is important in the movie, but what about the shots themselves? Did you see as being particularly noteworthy?
I feel like the shot especially the monolith shot, communicated about some idea about Kubrick's sort of conception pertaining to this movie of the God figure in this movie. God is mysterious. God is impenetrable. He's immovable. Right. That's what I think Kubrick is trying to say in parts of this movie. But I think that those shots are very, very important, and they all mimic each other in some way or the other.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, but a lot of the shots in this movie are very eye-catching and telling. And
Mr. Rallo, what would your one or two choices be, and why?
Right. So I think for me, first, what I would say is I think those initial shots at the very beginning of the movie, where they are just pure landscapes, all featuring the sun, all featuring. I think that the words that appear on the screen are like the dawn of man, and then you see these sort of still landscape shots, all with the sun and some sort of dawn or twilight or sunset. And it was really, for me, it's ambiguous as to what the sun is, what exactly time-wise is going on with the sun in those shots. And I just think that they're very much setting the context for what I view as a theme of the movie that I saw: isolation and sort of solemn silence. Those shots, I think, played a really big role in establishing that ethos at the beginning of the film. And then, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
No, continue.
And then one other one that I thought was really critical was the moment where Dave releases Frank into space, right? He lets him go off of the pod, and you just see this body, this sort of spiraling, circling body, get smaller and smaller into this just pitch inky blackness. And AJ mentioned to me the other night something like the prominence of circularity in the film shots. Okay. And you see all these sort of circles and moving in circles and rotating and flipping. And so I think that shot really brought that home in a lot of ways.
Yeah, that's interesting that you mentioned that, because this gets to one of perhaps my pick. These are all good picks, and it's interesting with the monolith and space and the kind of with the monolith shots, especially at the end, you disappear into the monolith and then the space and so on. And this idea of isolation. All right. So here's the shot that at least stands out to me. Among the many that you could choose. The first shot we see of the Jupiter mission, right, is the circle turning, the guy running, right? And he's running and he's punching the air. And what I was thinking about is that's a tie back, to maybe the apes. The apes pick up the bone. They start to, hit things. They start to hit each other, other animals. But the apes, right, like they're actually hitting something. And I thought that this first scene, right, you're running on this wheel, kind of like gerbils. You're going nowhere. You're hitting nothing, right? All of your work, and I think it's kind of a transition point that I didn't notice the first or second time I saw this movie. Between like what's really alive for Kubrick. The apes seem kind of more alive than the people, and Hal seems more alive than the people. It's almost as if like this kind of, you're just running in circles now. Your time is up. All of your actions, your motions, they're not landing, they're not connecting. Now, of course, you could counter that by saying Dave dismantles Hal, is able to take down Hal. But I don't know. I like this idea of isolation, and this can kind of get us into what is he saying about humanity here. What do you guys think? Who wants to jump in? Well, how about AJ? Why don't you go ahead?
Sorry, what's the question?
Okay, sorry for that, yes. What is Kubrick trying to say about humanity, the human experience?
I have all sorts of strange things, because this movie is definitely about humanity. I think that there's a couple different ways that I think you could take this. Okay, so this is going to be a long explanation. So I think, in short, I think that we need to, man needs to reject his role as creator in order to achieve, quote, the, quote, next level of evolution, I guess. Now, I have lots of theories about the, quote, next level of evolution pertaining to the monoliths and stuff. I think that like Kubrick is trying to make a point that our intelligence is brought to us by something foreign. We don't bring up our own intelligence, right? This is what I think Kubrick is trying to say. So they find the monoliths. Now you can stop me if I'm going on too long. Also.
Okay, well, just
all right, sure. All right,
get to the point. Go for it.
Okay. So me? What?
Yes.
Okay. So they find the monoliths, right? The apes, I guess, they're not quote human yet. They find the monolith, and then they sort of progress in intelligence, because of the monolith. They touch the monolith, and then, right, immediately they've sort of become, they become what makes them sort of human, quote. They learn how to use tools. The second monolith, they find it on the moon. They unbury it, and then, of course, the sun comes over the monolith, and then it sends a signal to Jupiter, signaling this higher power that they've achieved space travel, and that they're intelligent enough to come and find the, quote, God-like power, I guess. Then the third monolith, right? Now, I didn't understand what the third monolith was, but Stanley Kubrick himself, hold on, said like it was like a portal into a state of like reflection and examination, and that it was a portal into what he called he's taken into another dimension of time and space, into the presence of godlike entities who have transcended matter and are now creatures of pure energy. Then they create an environment for him, a human zoo, if you will. They study him. His life passes before him. He dies and is reborn, transfigured, enhanced, a super being. So that super being part, right, you have to remember that the fourth monolith is at the very end, right? And then he's sort of reaching out, and I saw immediately, I didn't know what it meant until I thought about it harder. It looks like that Michelangelo painting where he's reaching out towards God, right?
Yeah.
And then he sort of evolves into like the quote, the super being, I guess.
Yeah. Mr. Rallo, what were your thoughts?
Well, that's really interesting what AJ brings up about the monoliths sort of transforming Dave at the end there. I that's kind of interesting that those were Kubrick's quotes, because I need to watch it again to sort of see that. But here's my thought, right? I viewed the way that humans are described in the film, the way that they're shot, the way that their actions are sort of cast, as very descriptive rather than prescriptive. It felt to me like Kubrick was describing something about human nature or like the default mode of human action. Like, for instance, for me, it was very significant that the first thing that the apes decide to do when they discover this bone and its uses is to kill, right? And to he did not show apes like building structures. He didn't show apes like solving problems. He showed them entering into conflict with one another and defeating one another. And then the essence of the human action in the second part is this fundamental distrust between Dave and Fred and Hal. And for me, one of the huge questions of the film is Hal human? Does he feel emotion? And does he betray his colleagues? Or is it something else? And I'm not quite sure that you could answer something else. So yeah, that's sort of my thought. Like, he's describing humans, and it's not a good description.
No, yeah. Well, I think, it's interesting, right? The apes, the first thing that happens in the apes, quote, evolve, is they kill. They start to eat meat. They start to kill each other. The first thing, and you could maybe say, like, when Hal starts to, quote, evolve, he kills. I think that, human, like the astronauts, like Dave and, who's the other astronaut?
Frank.
Oh,
Frank.
Oh, I was saying.
Not Fred, right, Frank, yes, thank you, AJ. Dave and Frank are, I think, downplayed. What is interesting is, on the one hand, I think you see this kind of progress of, quote, evolution. But on the other hand, right, human conversation hasn't evolved much past the apes. The apes grunt and they communicate in this kind of, we might almost say, quasi, symbolic way. I don't know, I don't mean consciously. I mean, it's very rote, basic communication. But the human communication is also very basic. Nothing they say is particularly important or profound. It's all small talk. It's all, shall we say, we might say, semaphore waving kind of communication. How are the kids? Be a good girl tonight, honey. Like, hey, that was a great speech, Bob, or, whatever, oh, thanks for coming. That really boosted the morale, yes. And then on the Jupiter mission, you get a birthday message from Earth, right? And it's, say hello to Dave nothing. There's no profound dialogue, no profound speech in the movie. And again, the connection between us and the apes. So you get the sense, I don't know, is he trying to say that, right, all of this physicality is essentially irrelevant? I don't know. I found his message what I think his message was about humanity. A bit cold, distant, and a bit chilling and foreboding. As brilliant as I thought the film was. I don't know. I mean, briefly, would you guys agree or disagree with that? Do you see a different message?
I think it's really interesting. I actually found an interview with Stanley Kubrick where he said something specifically pertaining to his view on man. Or he said, man is the missing link between apes and human beings. They are semi-civilized. Man is in a very unstable condition.
Yeah.
So I think I would agree with you in that, like, his view on humanity is very cold and very, yeah.
Mr. Rallo?
I agree with.
Right. I'm glad you brought up the video chats that were in the film. I think they're very significant. Like the doctor, what's his name's conversation with his daughter is just so, like, he's leaving to go like up into space, right? And it's like this sort of, and the same with the birthday message was chilling. I mean, it was so. I agree with you that, and I think that it fits this sort of, he's not prescribing anything. He doesn't appear to be prescribing some kind of antidote for this. He just seems to be describing humans fundamentally, are these sort of conflict-ridden beings.
Let's transition. Maybe we can compare them, but let's transition down to the Tree of Life. I think the Tree of Life is Malick's answer to 2001. It is his kind of version of 2001. And here I think we see a film constructed similarly with an important and, quote, powerful soundtrack with not a lot of dialogue. With strong emphasis on certain powerful images. Yet, it comes from a very different place. Here, I think you see the solidity, the mystery of humanity, but also its solidity and, I don't know, relatability. This is a movie, Tree of Life, that if you see, I think, even though it's basically more or less set probably in the 1950s in general, for the most part at least, it's a movie I think that is very relatable. It's a different picture of humanity. What would you guys, how would you respond? Mr. Rallo, let's start with you.
Yeah, well, first, I would definitely agree with you that fundamentally the humans in Tree of Life are relatable, whereas fundamentally in 2001 they're not. Right? Just every single person, every single human in the Tree of Life is someone who is wrestling with fundamentally human questions and desires and longings, right? Mr. O'Brien wants to be respected and he wants to get ahead and he wants to win. Mrs. O'Brien wants the best for her children, right? And the kids, in a lot of ways, just want to be kids and they want to enjoy life, but they also want to explore, what it means that they're here and they're existing. So, yeah, I think you're right, it's a response, and I think you're also right, it comes from a profoundly different place, one which I think starts not with humans, but it starts with God, right? From the graph which asks the question, where were you when I formed the heavens? And then all throughout the film, you hear these sort of whispered prayers and these whispered sort of heart questions that people are asking in a way that's just non-existent in 2001, right?
Yeah, AJ, what were your thoughts on how Malick tries to communicate his points, in both technically and thematically?
Right. So I guess what you said, like, obviously, like, that's what makes Tree of Life so powerful, is that the things that happen in this movie are so small. but say it's so powerful because they are everyday struggles that we sort of undermine. It's very powerful, and I think that Malick creates this sort of picture of human life that we can all like put our, like of the shoes of humans that we can put ourselves into, and it gives a message of hope and that God is great and God is big. This film does a lot of things with questions, and then it answers them with simple images. Like I remember after the son dies, the mother asks, "Where were you?" And then we go into the creation cycle, right? He's everywhere. He's literally everywhere. And so we have a question, and then we have an answer through images. And I think it's brilliant. It's one of the best movies I've ever seen in my life. So I have a lot to say on it.
So yeah, I think AJ, you make a good point about Kubrick. I mean, Kubrick maybe being very content. I mean, which is what I admire, but to let 2001 have essentially just questions. Maybe not only questions, but predominantly questions. Tree of Life, I think, seeks a balance between questions and answers. Kubrick is interested, I think, in, we might say, nature, shall we say, the process of evolution, from ape through Hal, to monolith, or whatever the monolith is. Malick is interested in nature, obviously, and grace, which is made which is right in the first line of dialogue that we hear from Mrs. O'Brien. What then? Okay, so what do we do? Well, all right. So the technical question. Let's talk about images. We mentioned Kubrick's images. Let's mention some of Malick's images too. Go ahead, Mr. Rallo. What's an image from the film that sticks out to you in terms of his technique and what it communicates?
Right. So I think for me, as a general principle, what I think is the most fundamental thing or one of the most fundamental things to notice in the film is the real prevalence and predominance of shots where the camera is looking upwards, facing upwards towards the sky, looking up at a tree, looking up at natural features or at the sky. And I think that always you have these, for instance, like there's the moment where the kids, I think, are just playing football out in the yard, or they're wrestling with their mom. And you might expect, if you're watching an ordinary film, to just see a straight on sort of wide lens shot just showing the action. But here the camera is below them at their like ankles, looking upwards at them as they're doing this, with the sky and the sun in the sort of really prevalently shown in the background. And so I think just that subversion of the normal expectation you would have creates in a lot of ways a visual sort of tendency towards questioning and answering. When we look up, we're looking up for answers or for a response or for something like that. And so I think that's something that really stuck with me in terms of the shots of the film.
I like that. That's true. I think, right, Kubrick treats humanity as essentially as AJ was maybe suggesting, as a kind of go-between, as ultimately not really very important. Malick treats humanity as something, as part, sure, not the whole totality of the mystery, but as worthy of attention and as part of this mystery. That angle of the shot, that's an excellent point, Mr. Rallo. AJ, what did you see that stuck out to you from a, shall we say, technical, how did the technique lead to the thematic, the themes that Malick was trying to get across?
So one thing that really stuck out to me was these constant images of walking. There's tons of images of walking. And how I can relate to this is first line in the movie. Well, first line of dialogue in the movie. Like, the nuns taught us there are two ways to live, the way of nature and the way of grace. And it's my personal theory that the movie, the central thing about the movie is the journey from the way of nature to the way of grace. And so there's all these shots of walking, journeying, like after loss, both the father and the mother are shot walking into the woods. Jack, when he is having his own personal troubles, he is shot walking down the street in the dark. I think that these images of walking communicate, but right, it's something again that's really quite relatable, right? You know, it's like life is a journey.
But a journey. I think you're right, AJ. But a journey that leads somewhere. Like,
right, yeah.
You might say definite. Kubrick, of course, his people, especially in the Jupiter mission, they're obviously journeying, but one gets a sense that it's a journey for another, maybe journey for another thing, and that, right, the people journeying aren't particularly important in it. Malick gives you something different, though. For Malick, this journey is important specifically because there is an answer. I had never really thought about that, AJ, but you're right. The characters are often walking and shown, as Mr. Rallo pointed out, shown usually not at eye level, but usually shown kind of, from like leg level on up. Yeah. Do you have any thoughts on that, Mr. Rallo?
Well, yeah, that's actually, to piggyback on that, I think the scenes with Sean Penn, the adult Jack, right? Like, so he is sort of like the bracketing of the film, right? He plays a pretty prominent role in the beginning and a pretty prominent role in the end. And in the beginning, right, he is walking amongst this sort of concrete jungle, right? The way that the building is framed behind and above him in those beginning shots of the movie is so like, it's so totalizing. Like, this building, this sort of concrete monolith, maybe, I don't know, is sort of rising above him. And whereas towards the end, right, there's just the ocean, and he walks onto the beach, and you see him with just sort of without the interference of any of that city life. And so, yeah, I think that's a really good point, AJ, that, yeah, there's this journey, and his journey ends in a really positive and what feels like normative place. Like, he belongs on this beach at the end.
I think, sorry. I was just going to add, like, he stops walking when he gets to the ocean. He falls on his knees.
Yeah.
So he's, in a sense, reached the way of grace, I guess.
And his last shot, I believe the last shot of the movie, he's not walking, he's standing and smiling.
Yeah.
A knowing smile. He's arrived. His question is answered. We talk, like, with Malick, right, this idea of nature and grace, evident in the only other movie I've seen of his, but I think obviously very evident here. And maybe there's something to the idea that in order to experience grace, you need to experience nature. I mean, that, a lot of, like you say, AJ, his realizations are on the beach, at the ocean, maybe in a meadow. Whereas in 2001, maybe there can be no grace, quote unquote, because they are denatured. They don't seem connected one to another. They're sharing, Frank and Dave are sharing this spaceship, for who knows how many months or years or whatever it takes them, but they don't seem to have a relationship. Maybe, Mr. Rallo, you've mentioned Wendell Berry before, and certainly he puts a lot of emphasis on living quote, with nature or near nature or experiencing nature. Is there a connection, you think, between experiencing grace and the need to experience nature as a kind of precursor or necessary condition of experiencing grace? What do you think?
Yeah, so this is really interesting. Yeah, it's really interesting, and I wonder how you guys. So, like, I have a really interesting sort of theological perspective on it. I wonder what you would think on it, right? So, like, within the film, you think about Jack. He only recognizes the need for grace after he has experienced the way of nature as the film presents it himself. Like, I think it's such a critical moment when he hits RL with the slingshot. He hits his brother with the slingshot, and he betrays his trust, right? And then he goes to him and says, "Hey, you can hit me if you want." Like, he's trying to make it better. And there's a moment when I think he prays something along the lines of, like, I wish. Actually, right after that, he almost quotes Romans like 7:9, which is like, I do the things that I hate and I don't do the things that I want. And then he asks his brother to hit him, and his brother declines. And then there's this moment of forgiveness where I think he touches his shoulder or his head. So I think that's exactly right. Grace only can really happen when sin has been acknowledged, right? And otherwise, why are we asking these questions? Why is the story of Job so prevalent in the film? So, right. So I think, yes, I think that's
grace can only, how about, what did you say? Grace can only be realized?
Grace can only really be understood or recognized once sin has been acknowledged.
Right. Okay. So I would say, like, grace is always there, but maybe it's not seen until you see the sin. But it's also, the connection of seeing grace in nature, but not in the concrete monolith, right? That's interesting.
Would you?
The concrete building is maybe like Malick's monolith. I don't know. AJ, do you have any thoughts there in this relationship between the experience of nature and of grace?
I think that. Do you remember the sermon? What the sermon was about? It was about.
It was
about Job. And like how it was like you can't protect yourself. You can't protect your children. Everyone will meet, will come face to face with evil, and will meet hard times and all these things. So I think that, right, that it's hard to avoid the way of nature, and it's just how do we overcome it? And I think it's a lot of inward reflection and realization and self-examination that we can acknowledge our own way of nature, then live with the way of grace. Yeah, let's go ahead.
Okay, so do you guys think? So I think that Malick thinks. I don't know if grace and nature, so he sets up the way of nature and the way of grace dichotomy. The way the film is shot, though, I don't necessarily think that he believes that nature is anti-grace, right? I don't think nature is necessarily opposed to grace. Is it possible? I think Malick might be saying nature is a kind of, I don't know, a precursor to the realization of grace? I'm not sure. Do you see nature? I don't see him opposing the two necessarily. But I suppose you could say, well, why not? Because obviously the first comment is there's the two ways. I don't think he's necessarily saying they're opposite directions per se. But maybe you disagree. What do you think, Mr. Rallo?
Well, I wonder if there might be I wonder if when that first line, the way of grace and the way of nature, I did not view it as meaning like the natural order per se, or God's created nature. I viewed it as sort of like the natural struggle that is inherent in like the truths of biology, right? Like conflict, desire to be on top of the food chain, desire to be number one. Like I viewed that as the way of nature, not as referring to like nature as in like trees and the created order of things. And it's significant that the movie is the tree of life, right? And that obviously the tree of life is it is a natural source of grace, right? I mean, that's how it's created. So I think then what that means is that I agree with you, as long as, the way I'd phrase it is, nature, the natural order is not opposed to grace, but a sort of natural desire for primacy of place and a natural sort of conflicting tendency is the antithesis of the way of grace.
Yeah, he might be saying it's not so much like the trees or the bugs or the animals that are the problem, but mankind is the problem. And of course, it was, the sin of mankind that dragged creation down with him. AJ, do you see Malick as contrasting nature and grace, like as opposites or kind of partners? How do you interpret this nature-grace dynamic in the film?
What I would say is, I agree with you guys. I think that they're not complete opposites. I don't think the way of nature like completely 100% rejects the way of grace. It doesn't. I don't think it rejects everything about the way of grace. I think that, right, like what Mr. Rallo said, the tree, and I think that what he's trying to say, what he's trying to say is through these characters, through this journey, is that the way of nature is not, it's not forever. You can journey from the way of nature to the way of grace, and from the way of grace to the way of nature. Like the mother, she was portrayed as the model for the way of grace, and completely flawless until her son dies. And then she says things like, I just want to die with him. I just want to die so I can be with him. And then she is portrayed as walking into the forest. And then she arrives back at the way of grace.
Right. Yes.
So.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's good. These are good thoughts. So we're coming soon to the end of our time here. Would you guys care to offer some? I think these movies made about 35 years apart, I think are two important statements for us to wrestle with, especially, I think, in the modern world. I think, you see with our drive to, in the culture now, we must kind of become a lot of, shall we say, gender, sexuality, identity issues, I think, are wrapped up in this idea of becoming something more, of human nature as not a real thing, perhaps, as nature as not even a real thing. And I wonder if that is Kubrick's vision. The Tree of Life I see as a kind of antidote to that. And thus I see it as a crucially important film that I encourage our audience to check out, but I encourage you to check out both if you haven't seen them both, and do your own thinking and investigating. As we come to a close, which is the more powerful film? Which is the better film? And why? Let's start with you, Mr. Rallo.
Right. So I think that if you're talking about the art of film, it's tough for me to say that one is, quote, better than the other. But if we're looking for something to reveal truth, right, I think Kubrick is not interested in revealing truth. I think that he's interested in, as I think you alluded to earlier, Dave, leaving us, unsettling us with some really difficult questions. Whereas Malick begins his movie with a question, not from a human towards God, but from God towards the humans, right? Where were you when I created the heavens? And then we begin to see that God invites us into conversation with himself. And I think that when we watch the Tree of Life, if we aren't drawn into worship and prayer afterwards, then something even I believe Roger Ebert even said that it was a movie that led him into prayer, and he was very much an atheist. But there's something about it that is, I think, a liturgical experience. Even you mentioned the powerful soundtrack, right? Like, and I believe that the film ends with a hymn. I forget which exact hymn it is, but there is something worshipful and liturgical about it. And so I think in that sense, it is certainly worth watching. It's a powerful, moving film that will cause a response in the viewer.
Yeah. Sounds like you're giving the nod to Tree of Life then, in some way.
Absolutely.
Okay, yes. AJ, what is the better film and why?
I think that 2001 was revolutionary, but Tree of Life was one of the most powerful movies I've ever seen in my life. Like Roger Ebert, I have a lot of respect for him for what his writing, but he's an atheist, and a movie that can force someone like an atheist into a prayerful state, that's incredible. And I think he does it so perfectly. I think Malick captures the human experience and the human journey in such an incredible way. It's like baffling to me. Well, the first time when I finished it the first time, I just sat there and said, "Wow."
Yeah.
I think that his cinematography, like if you throw away the meaning of the movie for a second, cinematography is incredible. It's just fantastic. And what's said is meaningful. If there's no meaningless dialogue to just take up time or to fill a void for lack of shots. And I think that I go with Tree of Life every time. That movie is, I don't know if I would say like changing, but it's very, very moving in a way that 2001 is not. Because like I ended watching 2001 and I was like, huh? Just like, I guess overstimulated, I guess in a certain way. And I finished Tree of Life and I was in awe. And I was in awe, not of just the movie, but of awe of God. So. Yes,
I would say my 2 cents would be Kubrick gets a lot of credit for being for being revolutionary and for taking that first leap out of the dark and to make a film that was so very different from most any other film. What I would say is, though, that I think Malick's film has more, I think, confidence in the meaning and purpose of the film. Like Malick, I think, has more confidence in what he's trying to communicate than Kubrick does. And I think it shows. It is, I think, the greater work for that reason, perhaps. Although certainly I agree with the message. Obviously, I disagree with Kubrick's message as much as I understand it, and I embrace Malick's. But aside from that, I think there's that. Sometimes I think authors, musicians, right? They don't want to quite really answer the questions because they don't want to commit. They don't want to commit. And I think Malick is willing to commit in a way that Kubrick was not. I think we're all in agreement there. Well, gentlemen, I've enjoyed your thoughts, and you've given us a lot of interesting things to ponder. I want to thank you for your time. Thank you so much, Mr. Rallo and AJ, for joining us today with your thoughts on these two important movies.
Thank you. It was a lot of fun. Anytime.
Yeah, thank you.
You're
Honor.
welcome. You're very welcome. I hope that we'll have you both back again as guests, whether together or separate. And ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've enjoyed our episode today. See these movies for yourself and start a conversation amongst your friends. And until next time, bye-bye and God bless.
Thank you for listening to the Grumpy Old Man podcast. Be sure to come back for more episodes and to check out his companion blog at stickthemud.com.